Hello, chess fans, and welcome to my new tactics training series, Sharpen Your Chess Tactics. And what I'm going to be doing here is uh, presenting you with a tactical position, a position I find in my own tactics training or from games that I've studied, either master games, and if it's worthy, maybe games of my own as well. But the idea here is you're going to try to solve the position, and I suggest that you take as much time as you need and perhaps use a notebook or type it onto your computer, the variations that you see, and then compare it to my explanation. And what I'm really going to try to do is not only improve our tactical pattern recognition as well as our calculation ability, but also look at our thought process and try and make it more efficient and effective when we're calculating. Okay, so let's get started. So here is our position here, and you can pause the video. I'll give you 5 seconds to do that so you can solve it. Okay, well, let's take a look at the position. And before we get into any moves or variations, it's important to take a look at the position overall and get an idea of what's happening and come up with a few thoughts that we want to pursue. So the main thing that you might notice right away is this queen on e4 is being attacked by the bishop. And the bishop is actually skewering the white queen and bishop. So um, our solution probably involves moving the queen somehow, but also watching out for this bishop. Um, right away, we probably notice that we can't take the bishop on d5 because it's being protected twice and we're only attacking it twice. So um, the first move actually probably isn't too hard to spot, but let me go through a few of the moves that you might have thought of that um, that might not work out. So uh, first off, you might think of moving the queen to a position where it still protects the bishop. So something like queen f5 um, might be something you might think of, or queen to e2. Okay, and actually, queen to f5 has a little trick to it, which we'll talk about. Because we also notice that our king, the back rank of the king, is weak. So first, let's we could probably eliminate queen to e2 pretty quickly. And the reason you might come up with that is that you might be thinking, well, I'm going to protect this pawn on b2 as well. However, we just basically lose a pawn after this. Okay, and so probably not the move that we're looking for. Okay, and then we might look at queen to f5. Now here's the idea, is that if black were to do something like queen takes b2, which would attack this rook, we can try a tactic, an x-ray tactic here, where we um, attack the queen, which is protected by our queen, and this x-rays to the b8 square where we would check the king, and this would be lead to checkmate if it worked. However, black doesn't need to worry because he could just take this bishop on f3, and if rook takes b2, he's got his own back rank mate with rook to d1. So hopefully you saw that if that was one of your candidates that you considered. Okay. So then we might look at ideas like, well, actually, the idea I came up with, which I was able to quickly eliminate, was something like c4, thinking that, oh, well, maybe we have some type of forking idea here. So c4, but we essentially just lose this pawn. Queen takes c4, queen takes c4, bishop takes c4, and we are, the position's about even, but again, we're always trying to look for the best move in the position. So finally, you might notice, well, black has this e5 pawn that is uh, that is weak or unprotected, and also the rook on d6 is hanging. So whenever you are one of your pieces are attacked, there's a few things you can do. You could exchange pieces. In this case, it's not logical because the queen is worth more than the bishop. We can protect the piece and let it be exchanged. For example, we want to protect this, and we looked at queen to e2 and queen to f5. And then the other way would be to counterattack. And in this case, we would, where we try to attack something that is worth more than what our opponent is attacking. Okay, so queen to e takes e5, and actually that is the correct move. The key to this position, or to get the most out of this, so we also have to look at what's going to happen next. So hopefully you looked at a few of Black's options, and let's take a look at a couple of those. First, you have to consider what's going to happen if this bishop gets taken here, and that's pretty straightforward, right? Bishop takes f3, queen takes d6, and you've got a position where we basically up the exchange. Queen takes b2, and then we can do something like we can't. We're going to lose this pawn also, but we're going to be up to solid exchange after something like queen to f1. Or actually we could do something like queen to a3. But basically you have to recognize that we're up a solid exchange. Okay, so let's go back. So bishop takes f3 is okay. And then we could look at something like queen to d3, which is basically has a little trick here. If we take the rook right away, then queen takes f3, threatening checkmate here on g2. So king to f1 is the only way to avoid mate. Queen to h1 check, king to e2, queen takes a1, queen takes d5, queen takes b2 check, queen to d2, and queen to b5 check. And again, the position is even, at least in material, and should probably turn out to be a draw for the most part. We might look at something. Let's go back to the original position, or the position after queen takes e5, and we might notice that Black might just want to move the rook, and there's two squares to move the rook to. It would be d7 and d8. And again, we have to make sure, the whole idea here is that he's going to take this bishop on f3 if we don't do anything, or if we can't do anything to avoid it. So we need to consider what Black's going to do after we take on e5. Let's look at rook to d8. And here we have a nice tactic. Maybe you saw this in your calculations. Hopefully you did. With rook to d1. Okay, and then basically we are pinning this rook, or pinning the bishop. So if bishop takes f3, rook takes d8 check, king to h7, and queen takes b5. And again, we're going to be up the exchange and a couple pawns, so that should be easily winning. So rook to d8 isn't a problem. Okay, let's go back. But rook to d7, maybe trying to avoid that because now the rook is protected. And here, if we try the pin, it doesn't quite work. Bishop takes f3, queen takes b5, rook takes d1 check, queen to f1, and rook takes f1 check. And after king takes f1, Black is doing well, probably winning with a piece for a couple pawns. So going back to the position after rook to d8, we need to try to find something a little better for white that would be satisfactory. The idea is that if we can't find anything better than rook to d1, like we just saw, then queen takes e5 isn't, might not be that great after all. However, luckily we do have something better with queen to e8 check. And after king to h7, we can just take here. Bishop takes d5, queen takes d5. And what we can do here is try to dislodge the queen with something like c4. And after he moves, he has to stay on the d file to protect. We could play rook to e1. And we are a solid 2 pawns up with an ongoing, we're threatening to to trade off queens here, depending on what black does. So again, remember, the queen cannot take either of these pawns on this move because um, because this rook would be hanging. So actually, this looks good as well. Black does have one more move. So let's go back here. And that is probably the best move in the position, which is queen takes b2. And the idea here with queen takes b2 is to do the same thing we were doing, which is counterattacking, basically threatening the rook on a1 so we can't take right away. Now, this part is perhaps one of the most instructive parts of this problem because we have a few things we can do here. Obviously, we can't just take on d6 because the queen will take with check, and then after well, let's take a look real quick just to make sure everyone gets it. Queen takes d6, queen to a1 check, and then after king to g1, then well, we could do something like this: queen or bishop takes f3 check, king takes f3, and then queen takes c3 check. And again, it's fairly even. Actually, in this case, it's not because black will actually be up a pawn after something like king to g2, queen takes a5. Okay, so we can't take there. Okay, let's go back. Queen takes b2. So basically, we need to move the rook. Okay, and we could quickly see that b1 and c1 are not good squares because the queen will just take us. So we won't really look at that at all. Now we've got a couple ideas here. We've got rook to d1 with the idea of, again, pinning this bishop. We have rook to e1, and we have rook to f1. So let's take a look at them. And these are, you would have to look at each of these because you'd have to see if one of them is better than the other. Okay, so this is the key to calculation, is after you find the first move, you need to take a look at the following moves to make sure they're safe enough to play that first move. Okay, if that makes sense. This is part of the thought process. So let's take a look at rook to d1. And here we have to examine bishop takes f3. And then if we play rook takes d6, then we run into queen to c1 check, which will lead to checkmate. So the only way to go would be queen takes d6, and after bishop takes d1, queen takes d1, queen takes c3. Again, we're about even. Okay, so rook to d1 doesn't look great here. Okay, let's go back. Rook to e1, and a couple things here. You know, if we look at, again, bishop takes f3, of course, queen takes d6 is winning, but we have to look at some of black's other moves. Black could actually play something like queen to d2, which again would be counterattacking, and we'd have to move the rook again. But he has an even better move here, and that is rook to e6. And so now we see that rook to e1 is not going to be a good move at all because of this skewer along here. Okay, so let's take a look what would happen there. So queen takes d5 to get out of the way and grab that, and then rook takes e1 check, king takes g2, and now black is the one that's up to exchange, especially after he could just grab this pawn right here. So black is up in exchange. So rook to e1 is not good. So finally, we take a look at rook to f1. And again, the key here is that we need to make sure that this is safe for white, because otherwise we have to reject queen takes e5 altogether. Okay, and here we can take a look at bishop takes f3, queen takes d6, queen takes c3. Okay, and then we have queen takes a6. Okay, so based on this, we are up in exchange and a pawn, and this looks good. Rook to f1 looks good so far. Let's see if there's any other moves for black after. Well, the problem here is that the queen is forking the rook and the bishop, and the black queen, has no way to get back to protect both of these. So this is why, or protect them adequately, because the rook is protecting this bishop. So if we were to protect, for example, obviously if we go queen to b5, queen takes d6. Okay, and then if we try to protect the rook, then obviously we could just take here, bishop takes d5. Okay, so let's go back to rook to f1. So the solution is queen takes, well, let's go back to the beginning, I guess. The solution of this is queen takes e5, and then the best line for black is queen takes b2, rook to f1. Okay, hopefully you saw that when you originally did this problem. Then bishop takes f3, queen takes d6, queen takes c3, queen takes a6, and white is up a rook and a pawn. To close this video, I just wanted to show you the game from which this position is from, and it's from Laurent Fressinet, I believe is how you pronounce it, and Alexander Brozovic from Cannes 2002. This is after black's 36th move, which was bishop to d5, and the game went as we noticed in our problem. Queen takes e5, queen takes b2, rook to f1, bishop takes f3, queen takes d6, queen takes c3, and here white played queen to f4, I think with the idea of playing rook to c1, which he does on the next move, bishop to e2, rook to c1, queen to d3, avoiding the exchange obviously, but then after queen to b8 check, king to h7, white played a very nice move to finish off the game, queen to b1, which pins this queen to the king. So white is going to force that exchange and just be up an exchange and should win easily. So hopefully you enjoyed this game. The key the key takeaway I got from studying this position, and hopefully that you've taken away too, is that finding the first move is relatively easy, but we need to make sure in our variations that we've, when there are alternatives, for example, after queen takes e5, queen to b2, that we understand that there is a difference between moving the rook. We can't just say to ourselves, oh, well, I'll just move the rook somewhere and I'll be up the exchange, or I'll be able to capture this. We have to make sure that the move we make is safe, because if we move it to rook to d1, rook to e1, we saw that those positions are not good for white. And rook to f1 was the only alternative. So we have to see that at the first position. If you got that, then that's great. If not, well, we'll keep working on it. And that's what these videos are for. Thank you for watching this video. I hope that it was helpful for you. Come back next week for some more tactics training. And if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. And check out my other videos. I'm going to be trying to post twice a week. And I will see you next time. Have a great day.